Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Sharon Harper, and I'm the president of Freedom Road, a consulting group dedicated to shrinking the narrative gap. Welcome to a special conversation convened by Faith in Public Life and Freedom Road. It is Juneteenth. Say Juneteenth, somebody. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln formally issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which set free all enslaved people within the Confederate States. But the Union could not enforce the decree in the Confederate States. So in Texas, they simply didn't tell their people that they had been set free. And they enslaved their people for another 2.5 years until on June 19th, 1865, Union General Granger stood on a balcony in Galveston, Texas, surrounded by 2,000 federal troops. And he read the following statement. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. So friends, that was the news that our people received on June 19th, 1865. And today is our celebration of Juneteenth. It is time for us to dream of life after oppression. With us today to help us understand this moment and to dream a better world are Dr. Iva Carruthers. Iva E. Carruthers is a founding trustee and general secretary of the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference, an interdenominational organization within the African American faith tradition focused on social justice issues. Also with us is Alphonso David. He's president of the Human Rights Campaign. Alphonso is an accomplished and nationally recognized LGBTQ civil rights lawyer and advocate. Also with us is Linda Sarsour, an executive director of Empower Change and co-founder of Until Freedom. And finally, Jemar Tisby is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Color of Compromise, and he is president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective. So friends, thank you so much for gathering today. We are excited for this conversation. So let's dive in. I have one question to start off our conversation. The one who shall not be named said yesterday that he did a good thing. He made Juneteenth popular last week. People had never heard of it before, according to him. So I want to ask you to set the record straight. When was it and where was it and what were you thinking the first time you ever encountered Juneteenth? Whoever would like to go ahead and share your story.
I can go first as the elder, probably.
Yes.
So the first thing I will say about that unnamed person's comment is that it reminded me of the doctrine of discovery, in which you actually have native people on the shore, and then you have people not yet here saying they discovered America, okay?
Yes.
So, having said that, I would just like to say personally, I grew up in the period that is historically defined as separate but equal. And I went to a segregated school up north, but I had the fortune of having very powerful, aspiring and inspiring Black teachers. And so my first recollection was in 3rd grade, in which we had to do an assignment. And I had already been fascinated by the tales of Harriet Tubman freeing her people, finding out that she had actually gone to Hilton Head, which was a place where they took the quote freed slaves. And so the contraband were there in Hilton Head. She was a nurse among the people.
Wow.
And that's when I was introduced to the concept of Juneteenth. And that has been in my spirit since that point.
What did it feel like for you when you first heard about it and you were in third grade? Like, that's a really early age to learn about slavery and then also about freedom. So how did you internalize that?
Well, I internalized it, I'm sure, as a part of the DNA of justice that I carry around in terms of the communal intergenerational experiences of my family, and by extension, my extended family, and the notion that there is something called righteous indignation that defines the divinity within me, which gives me the obligation, the sacred obligation to remember and to proclaim.
Thank you so, so much. Thank you. How about somebody else? Who else would like to share? Alphonso, you need to unmute yourself. That's great.
Sorry about that. I thought I would miss that. Thanks. I'll go ahead and share. My ancestors were slaves in Arkansas and in Mississippi, and they migrated back to Liberia. That's where I grew up, Monrovia, Liberia. And after a civil war, traveled back to the United States. So I learned about Juneteenth when I was a teenager, learning about history. And as I learned about Juneteenth, it was somewhat disjointed and incomplete. But that is the first time I remember learning about Juneteenth and learning that the Emancipation Proclamation really did not end slavery as it had been portrayed. And in fact, it had taken several years before slavery had officially ended. But as all of us know, we still live with the vestiges of slavery even today. So learning about Juneteenth, again, I think the history books were incomplete. There wasn't enough information. And it took me a few years after middle school to really learn more about Juneteenth and the implications for Juneteenth for people that live here in this country.
Thank you so much, Alphonso. How about you, Jemar?
Sure. So I grew up in the Midwest, and we did not celebrate Juneteenth. My parents were part of a generation that didn't want their children to repeat the racial traumas that they had endured. And so how that translated was we didn't talk explicitly about race all that much, sometimes, but not all that much. And then much less about our racial history and our racial past. It was just very painful for them. And so I didn't grow up celebrating it. I think I had heard of it, but didn't understand the significance. That really came around 5 years ago when the Black Lives Matter movement took on national attention. And it was at that time that I was getting into the academic study of history. I'm a PhD candidate right now at the University of Mississippi. And so in the beginning of that journey, I was learning about US history and Black history. And that's when I came to discover what it was. And I very quickly latched onto it as this is a day we need to commemorate, we need to celebrate. And so probably for the past 3 years, I've been sort of personally and individually celebrating it almost like a 4th of July for Black folks. And so that's how I came to understand and celebrate Juneteenth.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Jemar. And Linda, how did you first encounter Juneteenth?
I am a product of the New York City public school system, and apparently it wasn't consistent, the curriculum across the board. And I missed out as a young person who went to elementary and middle school and even high school. Actually, my high school was about 90% Black. And I never learned about Juneteenth. And we're talking about New York City being a progressive city with a very high population of Black people and African Americans in particular, and a very large Black Muslim community. I mean, we have the legacies of Malcolm X in New York and Rosa Parks. I mean, it's just outrageous to think that I never really learned about Juneteenth. To Jemar's point, I might have heard about it or someone might have said it, but there was no celebration, even in a school like John Jay High School where I went, which was a 90% Black school. And actually a majority of our teachers were in fact African American. And so for me, similarly to Jemar, it's been probably in the last 10 years as being part of the larger kind of racial justice movement, criminal justice reform movement, where you really get to go look back in history and really start reading and understanding and listening to elders. I mean, as you know, I've been a mentee of Mr. Harry Belafonte for the last 10 years, and being able to sit at his feet and hear the stories from the past and bringing us forward. Juneteenth is an important, a day for him, and he has expressed that to us on many occasions. So I feel fortunate that I am here now, but unfortunately, it's not something that I grew up with and grew up knowing about.
That's actually really helpful. And I'll tell you, for me too, I didn't grow up knowing about Juneteenth. I watched Roots as a little child. I think I was 7 years, maybe 8 years old when Roots first came out. And that was my indoctrination, or my introduction to our history, to the fact that this history happened and my family was a part of it. But we didn't know a lot of the intricacies of the history. And the Juneteenth story, I didn't hear it until probably about a decade ago. In the midst of doing some of my first organizing work, I heard it. And when I did, the thing that struck me the most was, wow, what must they have felt like to have been enslaved for 2.5 years, longer than they needed to be? And what must they have felt like to be free? So, Dr. Carruthers, your work through the Proctor Conference has taken you around the world. To uncover the question posed again and again in the film Black Panther: who are you? Who are we? There was a time before the Atlantic slave trade when we were not enslaved. We were not thought of as slaves. So what have you discovered in your travels and in all of your studies about who we really are?
I think the one thing I have discovered is that there is truth to the notion that there is an African worldview and an African way of life. And that penetrates and allows for a boundaryless notion of community that is different from the Western European core values that has taken us to this moment.
Okay.
And those values are in relationship to what we might call the social contract. It's in relationship to how we define that which has value and who we value, and how we distribute the resources, and what it means to live the good life. And let me just say that in all of my travels throughout the African world, I have found that there is this notion of an African worldview, which can be embodied in the construct of, in South Africa, they call it Ubuntu.
Yes.
It means that I am because you are. I am because, or we are, and we are because you are. And that is a core value which speaks to how you think about the land, how you think about the air, how you think about nature, how you think about your relationships with one another. That is very, very different. And so when I think about the North Star or a new way forward, it has to do with going back and looking at, within the 21st century context, what it means to shift to a different set of values. Martin Luther King referred to it as a values revolution, a different set of values that grows out of the Africanity that affirms the diversity and at the same time the centrality of humanity. And so for me to hear Alphonso's story, I had no idea. But my great uncle expatriated to Brazil, and so my sister cousin married a Nigerian, and their two children have all three citizenships, right?
Right.
And so to understand that within the context of that diversity, what emerges is a sense of Africanity built on family and kinship, which allows me to say, Sawubona, I see you, I respect you, you are important to me, allows us to have this conversation, and I think a vision for a new way forward.
That's really, really important. And honestly, I've never heard anybody really tease that out quite like that, that one of the things that is distinct about our sense of identity as people of African descent, because we were spread out all over the world, is that it's not so much anymore connected to land, but it's connected to people. It's connected to the people and the lessons that the land taught us when we were there. Is that what you say? That's right? Is that what you?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, can you say that word again? Sawubona?
Sawubona. Yes.
I see you.
I see you.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you so much. I see you, Dr. Carruthers. I see you. So Jemar, on Juneteenth, we celebrate freedom from enslavement. But in order to truly celebrate, we have to understand the depths of the oppression that we actually experienced. So as an historian, I'd love for you to tell us what we need to understand about slavery that most people may not understand in order to understand the magnitude of the celebration of this day. And also, why is history important for this moment?
History is important for this moment for several reasons. And so in the Christian tradition, they say you can't understand the good news until you understand the bad news first. In other words, you can't understand how liberating this message was for enslaved people to hear unless you know the depths of hardship and suffering that slavery brought. And that's fundamentally a question of history. And so, we can get into this later, but I think in celebrating this day more widely, we also run the risk of people underappreciating the gravity of American race-based chattel slavery and sort of divesting this day of its significance and its soberness in many ways. And so just, a few examples of slavery. So it's important that it's not just slavery, it's race-based chattel slavery.
Okay.
And so we can say slavery shorthand, but I want to make sure that folks understand the type of enslavement that was happening. So it was race-based, which meant because you were of African descent, you were born into it, you lived in it, and you died in it. That was your life. And there were whole eras of US history when Black people were born, lived, and died in enslaved, and there was no hope on the horizon that anything would change. I mean, they couldn't have imagined the Civil War, even in the 1820s or the 1830s. And so that's an aspect of it, but it's also race-based chattel slavery, and chattel means property. There's a quote by a Black minister and abolitionist named J.W.C. Pennington, and he said this: "The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle. The cart whip, starvation, and nakedness are its inevitable consequences." And so as we seek to understand US race-based chattel slavery, we have to understand it as fundamentally an exploitative economic system, that in a capitalist system, your goal is to maximize profit and minimize loss. And if you've ever looked at an organization's budget, your biggest expenses, the biggest piece of the pie are wages, salaries, and benefits. And so the quickest way to cut costs is to lower those, or in the case of race-based chattel slavery, not pay your laborers at all. And that's what was happening. And not only was that happening, you then treated people as property. And so what would happen, Walter Johnson has this really powerful book called Soul by Soul, and he's looking at New Orleans and the slave market there, which was the largest one in the U.S. for a while. And he's talking about what it's like to actually be treated as property. And so when Africans would be taken off of the boat, they would be oiled up and shined up. They would sometimes, this is really graphic, but sometimes if they had dysentery, they would take cork and insert it so that there was no leakage. They would value people according to their height, their weight, their physical appearance. And it's very hard to get concrete statistics, but he surmises that in the decades prior to the Civil War, the slave trade destroyed 25% of first marriages and broke up to 50% of nuclear families. So children and brothers and sisters and parents being sold away and separated. And so these are just a few of the examples. So obviously there's mutilation. Women faced special danger because they were valued not only for their productive labor in the fields or with their hands, but for their reproductive labor as well. And that was often subject them to rape and other abuses. So unless we understand that,
Yeah.
we're not going to understand the significance of emancipation, nor will we be able to celebrate it with the joy that came to African people who were freed.
Wow. And Alphonso, as a lawyer and leader in the LGBTQIA plus community, are there things that we need to understand about the layered oppressions of enslavement and that anti-LGBTQIA culture in the colonial and antebellum period?
Yes, I want to second what Jemar said about the importance of our history and how that history informs our future and how we create a path to our future. So the Christian faith has unfortunately been complicit, not only in anti-Blackness, but also white supremacy and LGBTQ oppression. Right. So pre-colonial communities in Africa and in the Americas were largely inclusive of queer people. Before a certain viewpoint of Christianity spread across the world. And that viewpoint, there are clear examples of how that viewpoint actually further oppressed LGBTQ people as well as Black and Brown people. The Catholic Church had a doctrine of discovery. And that doctrine of discovery, as we all may know, gave the right to Christians to enslave people and to colonize countries. And the Baptist Church for a long time had a policy of excluding Black people. So similarly, the traditional Christian theology of human sexuality, wherein queerness was viewed as an evil or a sin, and in some cases, people still have that viewpoint, inflicted unspeakable horrors on LGBTQ people during colonization and all during American history, up until, unfortunately, today, where you see bias and you see hatred and you see indifference that is spread all over this country and in fact across the globe. Ignoring white supremacy and blocking the progress of Black people and Black lives cannot really be divorced from LGBTQ oppression. Despite the history though, I am interested in building bridges. I'm interested in how we can build bridges into the future, which is why at the Human Rights Campaign, we've created a religion and faith program. And the goal there is to find ways where we can elevate our common interests. One of the common interests is justice and equality. I mean, if you look at any scripture, you will find that it's driven by those principles. And so I'm hoping that we can do that. And, as we take a step back and learn about our history, we have to also see that LGBTQ people have been instrumental in the civil rights movement. We have Pauli Murray, we have James Baldwin, we have Bayard Rustin, Alicia Garza. They have all been instrumental in helping to frame some of the issues that we're talking about today and breaking down significant barriers that LGBTQ people as well as people of color have faced in this country.
Mm-hmm. So Linda, you are not Black. We can see that, we all know. But as we define Blackness in the United States, right? But was one of African descent. But the Palestinian people are arguably, they arguably occupy that politically Black space in Israel and Palestine. I want to ask, how do you think of Juneteenth as a Palestinian woman?
I really appreciate that, Lisa, for asking me this question. I just wanted to say, I didn't get to say this earlier, how honored and humbled I am to even be in this conversation with amongst giants and folks doing this work. As a Palestinian American, and you and I, Lisa, have had this conversation, I truly believe wholeheartedly that my liberation as a Palestinian is bound up with the liberation of Black people, and that when Black people are free in every corner of this world, the Palestinian people will be free. And in fact, we know this historically when we think of some of our giants in the South African apartheid movement. When Nelson Mandela said that we all know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. When we think about Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his commitment to the Palestinian people and standing up against Israeli apartheid. I mean, these are people who experienced apartheid in the same way that we see apartheid happening in Palestine. I also remember, it's like we go forward to go back, as Jemar said, you know, I remember when the Ferguson uprisings happened, these young people in Gaza who rarely have internet access saw what was unfolding on social media, watched the tear gas and the military go up against unarmed young Black people who are fighting for freedom and to feel safe with dignity in their communities. And these young people were like, we're going to share with you what we learned from our own oppression here in Gaza. Here's how you protect yourself from tear gas. You know, all that we're seeing in these uprising with wash your eyes out with milk, you know, follow up with that with water. Here's how you build barricades. This is what the children of Gaza taught to us in this modern time. And so when I saw that, I was able to be part of a larger conversation within the larger Black Lives Matter movement about the historical significance of Black Palestinian solidarity. I mean, it goes back way farther than just the Ferguson uprising. I mean, from Malcolm X to SNCC and Carly, you know, Stokely Carmichael, who really got up and became a champion to kind of challenge Zionism and Christian Zionism in America. And so for me, I'm just part of a long legacy of the solidarity that has already existed amongst oppressed peoples. And what I'll also say that Mark Lamont Hill right now, who many of you know, is working on a documentary. We do have an Afro-Palestinian community in Palestine, in Jerusalem. I mean, these are people who look like they are from Africa. They speak my dialect, they speak Arabic, they share our culture. So we also do have Black Palestinians. But also as a Muslim, you know, thinking about my own identity as a Muslim, in my research around enslaved people and the creation of this nation, what I do know is from our Black Muslim elders is that about 25 to 30% of enslaved people were Muslims. And remember, a lot of Black Christians now in their kind of lineage, there was forced conversion of Black people. So Black Africans had different faiths. They came from different faith communities, many of which were Muslims. And so I know as a Muslim, at least in my lineage, that I could be a Muslim today in America because there was an African enslaved Muslim who continued to be Muslim in their heart, even if they couldn't be Muslims publicly. There were stories of African Muslims who were able to figure out how to fast and how to break their fast based on the sunrise and the sunset. You know, people who figured out how to find the times to pray quietly, just by, again, looking at the different, you know, ways in which the sun rose, and even on understanding when Ramadan was based on the seasons. So there's a sacrifice here for even Muslims who are non-Black to understand that my parents, when they came from Palestine in the 1970s, my father didn't just walk off an airplane and be like, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Somebody died, somebody sacrificed, somebody had to be a Muslim in private in order for him to be a Muslim in public. And so that is my commitment. I consider my own story, and is why I'm still committed to Black liberation.
You know, I was in Palestine about 3 years ago. I was there in Bethlehem, and I went for a Christian conference because there's a lot of Christians apparently in Bethlehem, which blew my mind. And I got to talking with a group of men who were theologians about their relationship to Africa. And I asked them point blank, what is your relationship to Africa? And they looked at me funny. They looked at me like, huh? And I said, well, you know, what do you think? Do you have relationship? Do you have, you know, relationship with the nations there? What's the international conversation like? He said, we are Africa. That really literally blew my mind, because in the Western American construct, it is not Africa. It is the quote Middle East. And yet when we read the biblical stories, we actually see that Jesus didn't escape and blend in north. He escaped to blend in south. There was a real relationship because it was who they are.
And Middle East to what? You know, when you say the Middle East to what, who are you? Where is the proximity there? And I think that's important in the larger conversation.
Yes.
Last thing I'll say, you know, this is apparently a controversial statement, but I always say it because it's actually true. Mm-hmm. You know, Jesus, of course, we also as Palestinians and Muslims believe that Jesus was not white. Our scripture as Muslims is very, very clear about his features, and features very similar to how we express the features of Africans. And also that Jesus was the Jesus of Nazareth, and he was the Jesus born in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem is in occupied Palestine. Nazareth is now, as you know, under, you know, in our sense, is part of Greater Palestine, which of course now has become the state of Israel. So we have a very deep connection as Muslims and people of the Holy Land to Jesus as a figure who was Black, who had copper skin, who had woolly hair. This is how we were brought up to know Jesus. And then we come to America, and all of a sudden, everywhere we look are blonde, blue-eyed Jesus Christ. And I'm just like, this is not our upbringing. And to know that Palestinians and Arabs in the quote Middle East, you know, again, Middle East to the white Westerners, is that we believe that Jesus Christ, who's a very important prophet, we believe him as a messenger and a prophet of God, was Black. And that's our Jesus.
Mm. See, the thing that I'm teasing out here is the reality that part of the tactic of colonization is actually to center the white worldview. And the white worldview of the entire world, the entire colonized world, is that the world is what they make of it. And they were the ones who dug the Suez Canal. And so therefore it is not Africa. But there were people who lived there for hundreds of thousands of years before they ever dug that canal. And yes, they were. And so, okay, so now I want to throw out another question to Dr. Carruthers. So Dr. Carruthers, the Proctor Conference has traveled the country for the past several years conducting truth commissions. I want to know, what are the principal findings of the oppressions that people of African descent currently face in the United States? And as a womanist theologian, how do these oppressions impact women in particular?
There are a couple of ways I think I want to answer that. Let me begin by saying to my dear sister Linda, she is our sister. She resides, she speaks with a voice of one who represents what it means to talk about ontological Blackness, what it means to embrace the fact that your physicality and spirit is one that makes you, that's a part of your DNA of an African Palestinian Jew that Christians worship. And so that is what we are making every effort to reclaim in terms of our understanding, which takes us to truth. We don't have to apologize for the truth. And so the truth is the truth. And so when you talk about a truth commission, it's about shining light on the lies, right? So the Proctor Conference has been fortunate to be able to convene under its reputational authority commissions and insert the conversations in ways that can be transformative. The one most recently that we did had to do with the Elaine massacre, in which hundreds of Black people were massacred in Elaine, Arkansas. And I just want to suggest, therefore, that this whole notion of truth requires us to have the courage to excavate our history and not be shameful of it or run away from it, but rather to reinterpret it. And language is power. And so I don't like to talk about slaves and the poor. I like to talk about impoverishment and enslavement, which then puts a whole different frame of reference around the ways in which we think about our narrative. And so to be able to engage in a cross-discipline way with those who bring their authentic experience to an understanding of our cultural and historical roots becomes very important in the struggle for liberation that we are engaged in. And I think that the role of women is so important to that. My first trip to Brazil, I was astounded by two things. One is when we got off the plane, we asked our host, what could we do? And it was a part of the Black Theology Project. And I was the last director of that project, which in a way is the mother father of the Proctor Conference. And those on the ground said, you've already done what you can do. By virtue of you coming here, you have made space. Yeah. Your presence has created a new space for our liberation struggle. The second thing was, this was before women had the right to vote. And so we were very intentional about talking to women in Brazil. And we asked them, what is your number one struggle? And they said their number one barrier was the image of what it meant to be Black and woman. and that it was not healthcare, it was not education, it was the colonization of what it meant to be Black and woman.
Yeah.
And so the whole notion of beauty, the whole notion of what it means to be fully human and to recognize the sacredness of your womanhood is really at stake. And so the truth begins with those fundamental notions that the creation was a creation of male and female energy, and that it is the expression of that as an expression of divine humanity that we're in quest for in terms of balance. And it is inclusive of all of us.
Amen. Linda, I'm going to come back to you very quickly. For you as well as the co-chair of the Women's March, right? What have you found about the current state of women in the United States, and where are we hurting?
I mean, Dr. Carruthers is like speaking to my heart right now. You know, the state of women in America is hurting, and it's hurting because women overall have to understand, particularly white women, that this is the moment for Black women to lead and for you to follow. No questions asked. Black women in this country, Indigenous women in this country, if anything, they are the ones that want to get freedom and justice the fastest. And so when Black women have access to reproductive health care, when Black women have access to economic opportunities, when Black women, everything that women in America want to fight for, when the Black woman gets all of that, you will get it too. That's just how the world's going to work. And so what's hurting here is that white women, as you know, and we've seen the conversations, the Karen conversation, are in fact, for me personally, white women have been more dangerous in upholding white supremacy than the white man, because the white man is just very clear about who he is and what he, you know, represents. And the white woman falls oftentimes in this victim category. The Black women are so angry at me in the movement space. I'm crying. I'm not guilty. Stop blaming me for all the oppression and slavery. But what we see unfolding in our communities is white women who are often the first to call the police on Black people and people of color when they make them feel some sort of discomfort. And it's the same thing actually that happens in the movement. And you know this, Lisa, we've been in spaces with these women before, where it becomes about their feelings. It becomes about their comfort. And right now, in this particular moment, I'm talking about today, there is a generation of Black and brown young people who have gotten up again and said, enough is enough, and this time we mean it. You either get on the freedom train with us or you're just going to be left behind. So there's nobody waiting. No one's coddling the white people, and particularly not the white women. Like, for example, right now, as you know, we're in a national conversation and campaign about defunding the police. And the white women are like, I don't know that I really understand what you're saying, but could we call it something else? Because when you say defund the police, I said, I'm not going to call it what, it's not about you. It's not about what makes you feel comfortable. You're either with the defunding of the police department and reappropriating the money to our communities, or you're not. So I'm actually in the moment in my life that I've been waiting for in the last 2 decades, where I don't want the white money. I'm not going to be led by the white people. I'm not going to let them tell me who the bright messenger is, how to frame it. I'm not going to tell them to say, don't talk about Black liberation because that is this and that's too radical, and abolition. No, this is the moment for the talk about abolition. We're going to start with defunding the police department, but the end goal is abolition. And you know what? You don't got to be with it, because in the past, and you know this from whether it be LGBTQIA rights movement, women's rights movement, voting rights, you know, any movement, there were always people that didn't agree. So I wonder why we always wanted to have these conversations to try to reframe something to appease everyone. There was never a time where everyone was on board with anything. And so I think now we're in this really great place where white women are realizing that we don't in fact need you. And if you are going to come along, that's great. And you are welcome to a space where you are going to take orders and instructions from Black women and women of color. You are welcome to bring your skills to the table, but you are not going to frame our discussions, and you're not going to lead our discussions. And we're also not going to cater or appease to the lowest denominator or to the most easily offended in our communities or in our movements, as we have done in the past. So you saw this from spaces we're in. We always have to go to that conversation while our people are hurting. There are Black people being killed literally not last 2 weeks ago, yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. We don't have time for that. And so I wouldn't say we're hurting. I would say that the women's movement in America is becoming more clear. We have more clarity. We know who our leadership is and who is supposed to be. And that is Black women in our movement, Indigenous women in our communities, and women of color. and everybody else and all the other women are welcome to this women's movement. But the women's movement is not supposed to be, or has never been about 150 million women in America who are all part of the same movement. It is a movement also that is also about including our families. And that's the thing that has hurt our feminist movements in America before. This idea that, this is a movement that is against men. As Tamika, my colleague says, Tamika has a 21-year-old Black son. Her son is part of her women's movement. Her father is part of our movement. Our brothers are part of our movement. And this fight for justice and equality for women in America has really been based on a Western feminist kind of ideology,
Yes,
that says when the white women get what they want, they bounce on us, as they have done over and over and over again. I mean, the history is clear. And so we are in a moment where we're saying now it's our turn. And what's different about it this time, Lisa, is that when the women of color and the Black women get the things, you're going to get the things. But when you got the things, we didn't get the things. And that's kind of the different shift right now in the way we're organizing women, both here in the United States and around the world.
can I just I want to interact with that for a minute, and anybody else who wants to chime in as well. We have a little time here before we get into the last movement of our conversation. But I mean, recently I've had a lot of conversations with white women, and most recently a Facebook Live conversation with Jen Hatmaker that literally blew up. I mean, the first day, 100,000 people watched it live. And then since then, I think 800,000 people have watched it on Facebook alone. And then, lots more have listened to it on podcasts, and now also my IGTV series, right? So white women are actually getting this message. What I love about what you said is you are welcome on the train. They're welcome on the train, but we will not compromise with the truth. Talk about color of compromise, Jemar. Hello, somebody, right? So we will not compromise with this truth. The truth is the truth. And we will not reword it. We will not take anything out to make you feel comfortable. We will tell you the God's honest truth about your toxic tears and the impact of those toxic tears on the enslavement, on the oppression of Black, brown, indigenous people across this nation and really across the world. It's a tactic. But I also want to say one last thing. I know y'all got me fired up. So one last thing is that white women often do that. And the reason why they get what they want and then they drop it is because they too have been oppressed by white patriarchy to some degree. They're able to be white, but not fully white, because to be fully white really means to be male. Mm-hmm. And so, as long as they have, whenever they have sided with people of color, they lose some of their favor among white men. So I think what's happening right now for those white women in the movement is they're really having to ante up. Like, they're really having to choose. Mm-hmm. Will you stand and march with women of color, men of color, against white patriarchy, against whiteness, or will you, be with us until it hurts you at home or in your job or in your church, and then side with whiteness in the end? That's really the question for them.
And I get spicy about this white women situation because I'm traumatized. That's why I've moved on.
I think we all are to some degree.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think the important thing that I've been talking to white women about, and I got to this place in my life about, you got to tell the truth, take it or leave it, is where I am in my life. And what I've told white women is that it's not enough to march. It's not enough to come to a march. There really requires no courage for you to come and march with me in the street.
That's true.
What I say to them, it's about time to sacrifice. And that is going to require you, just Black people in our country, indigenous people and other people of color are sacrificing their actual lives. And what I'm asking white women to do in this moment is, if you really are with me, you got to prove that you're with me, because we have a lot of mistrust. And as you know, from many experiences that we've had in modern times and recently, and of course, historically. So in order for me to know that you're really with it and you're really in this movement in the moment that we're in, is you got to prove it to us. And so that requires you to make some sacrifices. And so, for example, I'm telling white women, it's time to sacrifice your relationships. It's like, are you ready to say to your racist grandmother that you're not coming to Thanksgiving dinner until she gets her act together? Are you going to stand up to your father? Are you going to stand up to the person that you love, your partner, your husband, your son, whoever it is in your life that is engaging in the not just the rhetoric and the beliefs, but these are beliefs that are harming people's lives. And I think if you're not ready to stand up to someone that you love in this moment with what's happening around us, then you're not really my friend, and I can't trust you with my life. And so it's one of those moments of reckoning, that confronting of the your whiteness and white supremacy, and your confronting of your white womanhood. I mean, there are Black men in our community who literally die because a white woman felt uncomfortable. And I mean, you've seen this, the Amy Coopers of the world, that was one viral story, but it happens all the time in New York City, and it happens all the time across the country. So I think we're in a moment right now, Lisa, where we're telling white women, you got to prove it. And the courage that is required is, instead of you coming to Minneapolis to the Lake Street and standing over here and holding up a sign, or coming to a women's march and wearing a pink hat and holding up a sign, which I'm not going to take away from. Obviously, I was the co-chair of the march, so that was a historic moment. The bottom line, it was led by 3 women of color. It was a Black woman, a Chicana Mexican woman, and a Palestinian woman. And so I'm not taking away from that history, but what I'm saying to you, it's not enough to come with a pink pussy hat with a sign. My question to you is, do you have the same courage to stand up against the people in your community, in your family, who continue to be part of the larger systemic problem of unconditionally supporting law enforcement, unconditionally supporting the failing systems in our country, education, healthcare, you name it, we're in it right now. And unless you're ready to do that, I'm not going to trust you. I'm not going to believe that you're really in it for the liberation of Black people and other people of color.
Nor should you trust. And I want to repeat for everybody, the reason why we have sat on this for a minute is not just because, we want to center white women. No. It is about the reality that one of the main things that has kept Black people and people of color under the thumb of white supremacy has been the ways that white women have reinforced it. It's what Linda began her statement with, is that white women have been more avid protectors of white supremacy and white patriarchy than even the men. So now is the time to step up. This is your Juneteenth. Now, Alphonso, how do the intersectional oppressions of race, sexual orientation, and gender identity impact the LGBTQIA community right now?
It's quite a question. And I was going to say something with respect to this conversation you two just had about white women, and I think it's a legitimate conversation to have. I've been looking at this issue as it relates to everyone who needs to step up and stand up to make sure that we're actually fighting back against oppression. And the reason why I frame it that way, the discussion about white women is incredibly important, but there's so many other pockets of communities that have not risen up when they should have.
That's true.
And I see it through this lens of, how do we deconstruct hierarchies of identity? We have hierarchies of identity that exist in different spaces. In many spaces, the visibility of Blackness has been juxtaposed with the invisibility of queerness. So if you walk into a room as a Black man, I'm a Black man and I'm also gay. But in some instances, I have to leave my sexuality outside or leave my race outside, depending on which space I'm walking into. That is what's asked of so many people. And there are significant collateral consequences when people have to leave a part of their identity out of the door. We end up devaluing certain parts of our identity, and the collateral consequences are significant, as I said. For example, for Black trans women in this country, we have at least 177, since we've been counting, the Human Rights Campaign has been counting the killings of transgender members of our community and gender non-conforming members of our community, largely Black and Latinx. 177 people have been killed since 2013. This year alone, we have at least 16. Last year, we have at least 27. It is not the front page of the newspapers. So when we think about patriarchy, when we think about oppression, when we think about the intersectionalities of our identities, what we find is that there's certain identities that are oppressed within spaces that we tend to classify as marginalized. But I don't want to leave my sexuality, and I will not leave my sexual orientation or my gender identity outside in order for my race to be recognized. We just had a very significant decision come through, several significant decisions, but certainly 2. The DACA decision on Wednesday, I don't know what day this is, Wednesday or Thursday.
Friday, so that was Thursday.
Thursday. the Title VII case that came out on Monday. And, you know, as much as the court has recognized the importance of the rule of law in stare decisis in our Constitution, we know we still have a lot of work to do. We know there is so much work that we have to do. The court, recognizing the interests of marginalized communities, issued those decisions, and that's great, but we have a lot of work to do. And finally, I'll just say, as we think about intersectionality, COVID-19 has really highlighted how marginalized communities have been disproportionately impacted. Black and brown communities and LGBTQ community has been disproportionately impacted. 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people live in poverty. 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people have not been able to see a doctor because they don't have health care. Wow. More than 40% of LGBTQ people work in industries that have been disproportionately impacted. So the intersectionality, the interest in really deconstructing how we create these hierarchies of identities is really important for us to get to that place of equality.
Mm-hmm. So for all of you, now it is time to dream, friends. For all of you, over the past 3 months, we have seen the impacts of the racialization of American domestic policy through COVID-19, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and most recently, Rayshard Brooks. Juneteenth is a cusp day. It's a day that exists in the in-between. It is the moment of celebration between oppression and liberation. And it is that time when our ancestors gathered their dreams and realized that they were possible. In the next moment, they got to work, right? It was that time right after Juneteenth that they built their institutions, societies, towns, businesses, universities, fraternities, and sororities, all of which contributed to the lifting of our people. So now is that time for us. Now is the time to imagine that day in the 21st century when we are set free in November. Hello, somebody. I am believing the Lord for that day of emancipation in November. And so what will emancipation look like today? Whoever would like to speak.
Yeah, so I was on earlier today with an award-winning historian, Dinah Ramey Berry, who studies slavery and other aspects of US history. And she was saying, you know, there's not one emancipation, but there's many emancipations. And I thought that was just so helpful. You may have seen the t-shirts going around on this day that say free-ish. And I love that sentiment because it's so true. In 1865, after emancipation, Black people were freed from one type of enslavement, but then they were put in different shackles. I live in the Delta. And so Dr. Carruthers, I was actually there in Elaine when the Truth Commission was going on. And I thank you for your work. That was powerful. I live in the shadow of the monument there. So it's a very real history, this generational poverty, this concentrated poverty. I used to be a public school teacher. And so seeing the effects of this on our students each and every day. And so we have more emancipations to undergo. You just referenced a moment ago, Lisa, the getting out from under this regime in the White House right now. And so what does emancipation look like? It looks like the full restoration of the Voting Rights Act. It looks like protecting our right to vote, which we are still fighting for from the foundation of this nation on up through the Civil Rights Movement, on up through the present day. And so that's pressing work. That's work that I urge faith communities that I'm a part of to be involved with. That's one sort of emancipation, but there are many different emancipations that in the circles I'm in with dealing with a lot of white Christians, there's a hesitancy to get involved on a political level or a policy level with certain issues. With other issues, they're all over it on a policy level. But when it comes to racial justice issues, well, that's a different story. And so I'm trying to urge folks to get on board and understand racism not simply as an interpersonal issue, one person not liking another or mistreating another, but that it's embedded in our policies and our institutions and our systems and in the way we have structured society today. And so what I'm dreaming of is another wave of reconstruction. I mean, wouldn't it be so powerful if we had a different political vision right now, and we could look back at 2020 as a major shift, a major turning point where we really make gains over neoliberalism and far-right conservatism, and we have systems and programs in place that really uplift what Jesus in Matthew 25 calls the least of these, right? Where we're truly loving our neighbors that we're around. So I think this is what Walter Brueggemann and others call the prophetic imagination. And we get so mired in the present day and the struggles that we're in now that sometimes it's hard to have that vision for the future and what it might be like. But when we craft that vision, when we paint it, when we focus on it, I think it gives us motivation to continue the journey today.
I see Dr. Carruthers has unmuted her mic. She was rocking for a minute. So I know you have a word.
I don't know. I was just feeling the word coming my way, but I think Alphonso really helped to shape what we mean by emancipation. For me, it's quite simply being able to bring the fullness of my humanity into every space in which I engage other people. And not only my humanity, but my grandmama's humanity, you know, and the child in my womb's humanity, because we have created a crucible of a different paradigm of living, of understanding, sawubona. You know, I see you, I feel you, I respect you, you are important to me. And so when the Messiah wake up and they don't say, how are you? They say, how are the children? And how are the children yet to be born? That's a metric of the wellness of society. And so emancipation is the North Star. And I think what we're grappling with are those incremental strategic accomplishments towards emancipation that we have to go. So the question for me is, how do we create networks of intersectionality that allows us to have a common goal and agenda around which we can use all of our resources in order to get to that North Star that is the real emancipation, right? And understanding in some ways that in African tradition, time goes backwards. It's not linear, it's circular. And so the fullness of the emancipation is to go back to the divine, right? And it is in the divine that I see you and you see me, and that we're all made in the creation and the image of God. And so as a woman, I know that my ancestor, you know, Annie Julia Cooper said, when I enter, the race enters with me. I know that Malcolm left us the words that, you know, no race will ever transcend above the status of its women. The birth canal, the being the midwife. We are midwives. We are midwives. So for me, I recognize there will be no emancipation tomorrow. But I do know that what I do today is charting a course for who I am going to be as an ancestor, as well as the footprints I will leave for the children yet unborn. And that's my commitment every day. And so the North Star towards the emancipation, Harriet Tubman envisioned this moment for us.
She did.
And we celebrate her as a mother of the movement.
Okay, so I just came from church. You took me back to the Proctor Conference. By the way, anybody who has not been to the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference, you must go. It happens every February, usually the third week of February. Is that right?
Yeah, something like that.
February, over the pretty much the whole week.
Yeah.
And so you got to block out your time. You got to plan for it now. You got to save for it now, because it's not a joke. It's for real. Yeah. But it is literally it's my must go to conference every single year. I might miss others, but I will not miss that conference.
And can I just say one last thing in terms of the intersection? So what Proctor has done this day is to announce that, one, we have convened our first meeting of a COVID-19 bioethics commission, which represents an interdisciplinary group of scientists and humanists, et cetera, who are going to make sure that we access and interpret the data in the interest of people of African descent. And we have also created and launched our Center for Reparatory Justice, Transformation, and Remediation, a center for reparations and healing and transformation in partnership with McCormick Theological Seminary. And that represents for me this vision of where we are going and the hard work ahead. It's not going to be easy work, but with conversations like this, we can push that paradigm so that we're in a different playing field as we craft a new way forward.
Amen. I'm going to skip forward to the next two questions, and I want anyone who wants to answer either of them to please chime in and just share your heart, share your thoughts. The two questions are this. This is for the first in the short term. What are the steps that our viewers, we can take right now in order to begin to build our dream, to begin to build the dream in the same way that our ancestors did in the days following the first Juneteenth? That's the first question. The second question is, what is the horizon? So who here wants to paint the horizon for us? That place that feels like the further we keep walking, the further it gets away, but it's the direction we're walking in. What does it look like?
I'll try.
Okay.
To answer both questions.
Okay.
And I'll try to do it quickly because I know we may be running out of time. With respect to the first question, I would think, for me at least, it lives both in the secular space and the spiritual space.
Mm-hmm.
And I would ask for people to really do everything in their power to see how we can fully realize the words of the Constitution, the words of the Bill of Rights, and statutes and laws that exist. All of these documents have existed for years, but unfortunately, they are applied very differently to marginalized people. Mm-hmm. So how can we, in our individual capacities, make sure that we have a full realization of those documents that exist? And then separately, we need a radical reimagination of what it should look like. Mm-hmm. And what should it look like in the future? What should the world look like? What should our relationships look like? How should the statutes and the policies govern our behavior? What should that look like? We need to have a radical reimagination of what we want to see in the future. And then I think finally, I would say in the spiritual space, I know that God loves me with radical love. I would ask for people who consider themselves people of faith to use that principle and interact with every other person in their lives with the same amount of radical love. Mm-hmm. And what can you do in using all three of those principles? The Constitution, radical reimagination, and thinking about how we can use radical love and engage with each other. Make sure that as you step out of your house, as you engage with each and every person, see beyond yourself. Mm-hmm. See beyond yourself. Can you get to the point where you are not advancing a policy, supporting a proposal because it benefits you directly, but instead supporting a policy, supporting a theory, supporting an action because of the impact, positive impact that is going to have on others in our community? Mm-hmm. That is what we need to do.
Mm. In our tradition, in the Christian tradition, we talk about the image of God existing within all humanity. And often what I will say at the end of a talk that I'll give is I'll actually ask people to look into the eyes of their neighbor and look for the image of God beyond their eyes. And so what would it look like for us to actually see the image of God, the inherent dignity in each person, and vote to protect that, to protect the inherent dignity of each person beyond our own people. Anybody else want to take a stab at that last, Linda?
Only because I'm an organizer.
Okay.
So I would say two things, just in the not short term, but like right now, like today. Yeah. I want people to know that right now, the thing that I'm focused on is I'm working with the Breonna Taylor family, and we're working specifically on this case because one of the things that we have found is people will be in the street for our brothers and they deserve all of that solidarity and all that love, but we cannot forget our sisters, and the police officers who murdered Breonna Taylor have not been charged for her murder, and that's not okay. So on June 25th at 11 o'clock, if any of you are in the region of Frankfort, Kentucky, outside of the state capitol, we're going to roll up on the state attorney general there to ensure that he knows that we have not forgotten Breonna Taylor, and that she will get justice. And we will not stop until she gets justice. The second thing that I'll say to people that helps us, and it may not be framed in this way, in the way people are talking about it, but it is in fact part of the accomplishments towards true emancipation, is that when we start defunding police departments, when we start reimagining alternatives to public safety, when we start taking resources from police crime, police and punishment, and put it into quality public education, in economic opportunities, in housing, and we start giving our people, giving Black people, giving poor working class people the means not just to survive, but to thrive. Mm-hmm. I know that is going to be, and we're going to start feeling like we are on the pathway to emancipation. And for me, the horizon is just, it's beautiful, it's colorful, it is perpetual joy. Like what I hear, I just hear children laughing, all laughing and rolling around on fields of grass. And I think Dr. Carruthers said this, I mean, for me, I always think about the children. What do the children feel? And what do our children feel today? They are traumatized. They are seeing pain. You cannot shelter children these days from violence and from what's happening around them. So for me, the horizon is children that are in perpetual joy. And what I'll end by saying is that, and Dr. King said this, and many people have said this before, is that, a lot of us who are in this work, like, I don't ever believe that I'm going to see the fruits of my labor. I never believe that there's a confirmation that I'm going to see or even experience those children in perpetual joy. But like Dr. Carruthers said, knowing that I may not experience it, but someone else will after me, that gives me a fulfillment and a contentment. So I want people to know that it's not about you have to win tomorrow or next year or 10 years from now. Just know someday somebody's going to win. And the question is, what did you do about it? And something that I've learned from our Indigenous leaders is Indigenous people say that they work for 7 generations to come. And 7 generations is far away. And the fact that their actions today, their commitment to the earth today is about the result or what the 7th generation later is going to get is something really powerful. And I think something that we need more in our movements. And so I just want to say God bless you and protect you all. And Alphonso, something, that you said that resonated with me as a Muslim. And, I can say that my faith is perfect, but my people are not perfect. And, our God, Allah, which is the same God that Christians and Jews follow, has 99 names: the most loving, the most forgiving, the most kind, the most generous, the most compassionate. And I always say to people, if that's your God, if that's the God that you follow, that you claim is the most kind and the most compassionate and the most forgiving and the most loving, then how can you not be kind and generous and loving to others? And so that's why I always say to people that, if we literally follow our actual faiths, our actual gods, we would not even have to experience any of the injustice that we're speaking of today.
Yes, thank you so much. Anyone else want to speak? I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for giving us your heart, for giving us your minds, for the communion that happened around this table in this time. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Faith in Public Life for co-convening this space with Freedom Road. Thank you for all those who showed up on Facebook Live. Can I just say, y'all rock? Thank you for showing up. And also, I want to ask if any of the panelists have links to the things that you're doing that you want us to know about. If you could actually just share them in the chat here, and then Kelsey will share them in the comments on Facebook Live. Kelsey, Faith in Public Life will do that. And then also we will as well at Freedom Road. That'd be really great. You can please follow us, continue to follow freedomroad.us on Facebook and also Twitter and Instagram, as well as Faith in Public Life in all 3 spaces for opportunities to grow and continue to engage on all 3 of those platforms, and also our websites. And in the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your Juneteenth celebration day. God bless you. Have a good one.